Um, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum everyone. I have no clue if you're actually watching this or if you can see this. I hope you can. If you can, give us some kind of comment or something. But Jazakallah khairan for tuning in. We haven't done this for a while since the lockdown began. This is the Islam Trinity live kind of unscripted podcast, and many of us have been looking at the news coming out from Batley and some of the mainstream kind of hysteria and narratives with a bit of annoyance. Okay, it's working. Alhamdulillah. Can you hear me? I'm just speaking to Hamza here. There's probably a big delay. But yeah.
Okay, it's working.
So no surprise there. We've got Hamza Tzortzis joining us today. Alhamdulillah. Let me just switch over to the screen with the magic of both of us now. Yeah, mashallah. Assalamu alaikum, Hamza.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome to this very slickly and non-last minutely organized live stream. How's it going?
It's good. I apologize. I don't have very good lighting here. I do apologize.
No, there's enough nur coming out of your screen from my face and reflecting on you. So, what do you think I was going to say? So we've both been looking at the news coming out to the last few days. I think 22nd of March, this thing happened with this teacher, and a bit of, different reports coming out what actually happened. But the long and short of it is showing some cartoons and teaching the kids to, take it on the chin. And this is, blasphemy and all that kind of stuff is against, the spirit of free speech and all that kind of stuff. So a lot of people have been looking at it and saying, oh, not this again. But there's also a very important kind of dimension of, speaking up and defending and showing your love for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What do you think? What was your initial reaction when you heard about these stories and stuff?
My initial reaction, or one of my initial reactions, was, here we go again. It's freedom of speech versus the backward Muslims. Now, I don't know the context and the variables of what happened concerning the teacher. I know it's a little bit more nuanced than maybe what some of us are saying it is, given the fact that there are other student accounts and so on and so forth. So I'm not in a position to justly talk about what actually happened in the classroom. But what I can talk about, hopefully, is the incoherence of the false narrative that it's about freedom of speech versus Muslims.
Yeah.
And, for God's sake, it just shows how really, I don't know what words to use, to be honest. We've become stupid. It's a stupid argument. Yeah. I mean, stupid is a light word to use.
I mean, you probably take it personally because you're into your philosophy and reading and stuff like that. And this is like to describe this as simply reduce it to free speech versus some religious kind of sensibilities is like a celebration of illiteracy.
Yeah, that's a very polite way of putting it.
That's some polite like that.
Yeah, but come on, sometimes we have to call a spade, yeah. And this has nothing to do with freedom of speech. It's to do with values. Even from a philosophical point of view, it's very hard to find in the philosophical academic discourse someone advocating for absolute freedom of speech. I don't think it exists. And if it does, it's considered an incoherent position, because they say you should be able to say anything, irrespective of implication and context. And if you restrict it, then it's a slippery slope to tyranny. But this is a false, it's a fallacious argument, because one could argue, therefore, that saying anything you want could be a slippery slope to anarchy. So it does, the door swings both ways. And the academic David Van Mill, he actually articulates this really, really well, that there are restrictions to speech, and those restrictions can be justified. Just because there's restrictions, it doesn't mean now all of a sudden you've insulted this kind of, the holy calf, right? The golden calf, your intellectual golden calf, or pseudo intellectual golden calf. That people, they have this some kind of false adoration to this idea. It's like sub-mental adoration, using the words of Martin Lings. It's sub-mental, really. It's not even intellectual. It's sub-mental. I really think it's based on their shahawat. It's just they want to be. They don't want nothing to impose on them. They don't want no sense of there is a master above them. They just want to worship themselves. It's shahawat. It's pure, utter desire. Frankly, we should stop the live stream. You don't even have to intellectually discuss it. It's not even an intellectual position.
Okay, thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope you like this. Give it a like and share.
But anyway, look, notwithstanding the passion, I think it's very important to understand that the academics and in the philosophical discourse, they say that there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech from the point of view it's not coherent. Since it's not coherent, then we have to appreciate that freedom of speech is going to be in the context of other competing values. So David Van Moel, he makes that point, is other competing values. So the question therefore becomes, what are your values?
Yeah.
Now, you have to understand the history of freedom of speech from the perspective of that, if you go to John Stuart Mill and others, you see that it's there as an instrument. It's an instrument for justice. It's an instrument for truth. It's an instrument to accountability.
And I mean, in Islamic terminology, you'd say it's maqsoodun li dhati or maqsoodun li ghayri. Yeah, sorry. So from the perspective of... If something is desired in and of itself or intended by the lawgiver in and of itself, or is it intended as a means to something else?
Good. Yeah. So it's either instrumental or it has intrinsic value. That's what we would say in the philosophical language. So no one would say it has intrinsic value, because that would be bizarre, because that would be almost suggesting...
But that's how people... That's the belief that they betray when they do these types of tamasha, right? Because they're assuming it's something kind of sent down on a tablet that thou must have free speech just for the sake of free speech.
No, free speech is instrumental, because because there are so many situations where you can use your so-called liberty to express yourself, and it goes against the fundamental objectives or goals of freedom of speech. I'll give you an example. Imagine Stephen Hawking, the late academic scientist. He wanted to announce the truth of his new theory, and he starts his presentation spending around 15 minutes insulting the lineage and the mothers of everyone in the room. Is that going to be conducive to him expressing the truth of his theory?
Of course not.
Good. Another thought experiment. Imagine we go to the Chinese consulate or the Chinese ambassador in London, and we manage to speak to him, and we want to hold him to account and call him a genocidal maniac, which he is, right? The CCP are genocidal maniacs. Imagine though, in speaking to him and we want to take him to account, we start insulting Chinese culture.
Yeah.
Is that going to be effective accountability, bro?
Well, no, but you're assuming accountability is the aim of the game to start with.
That's the point.
That's not what's happening here, is it?
Agreed. But this is what we need to articulate to people, because what we need to show them is that since freedom of speech has objectives, it's an instrument to certain ends, such as truth, accountability, and progress. Because that's the argument they make. Oh, you have to have freedom of speech because the minute you talk, you have to risk being offended. And you have to risk offending others because truth is so important. Yeah. And you hear even Professor Jordan Peterson making such claims as well. I think they're very unnuanced, and he's not a philosopher, he's a psychologist, and it shows, because when you unpack the idea, it's not that simple. It's simply not that simple. You have to understand that if your goal is truth, then the way you express yourself would have to be conducive to truth. Yes, I appreciate that gray areas. Some things are going to offend people anyway, but there's a
difference between accidentally causing offense in trying to make a rational point and wanton, deliberate, summary, quote, and insult.
Yes, absolutely. So some of these thought experiments that we've just given you shows that your so-called liberty to express yourself, even to the degree where you think liberty to insult and to degrade is part of freedom of speech, in actual fact, it goes against the very objectives of freedom of speech. These are enough to make people realize that, okay, we need to now be a little bit more nuanced in how we understand this situation. So,
ironically, it's quite kind of literalistic and very dogmatic of some people, just to hang on that slogan of free speech without actually looking at the philosophical and the moral intentions behind, coming to a conclusion that it's actually something good in its proper place. It's a bit like, somebody, finding an example, obviously your mind goes blank, but like a Muslim, for example, staying away from alcohol, but doing so by, smoking weed all the time or something. Because saying, well, I'm staying away from alcohol because so they're following the literal, not drinking wine, but they're drinking some other intoxicant, not knowing that the point of saying don't drink alcohol is to not be intoxicated. So not understanding that certain rulings, certain instructions, certain moral kind of imperatives are a means to something, some other underlying reality, leads to absurdities and leads to kind of this dogmatism. And it reminds you of what a lot of people say about secularism per se. It's just that it's not neutral as it's presented to be. It's actually just blind to its own religiosity.
Yes,
right?
Yes. And that's why we have to bring these discussions to the forefront of the discourse. And what's important is this: we also have to show the inconsistencies. At least be inconsistent. Fine. On one hand, you could be incoherent philosophically, but be consistent with your incoherence. Yeah? Come on. At least have some virtue somewhere. Be virtuous in something. Fine. You're not going to follow truth properly. You're not going to be coherent, but at least be consistent with your incoherence. Like, for example, someone did a Twitter post saying something offensive about the very nice old gentleman that recently passed away from COVID, and he raised like millions of pounds for the NHS. He was I think the police charged him for an offense, right? And now no one would ever say, especially in our British public, would ever say, oh, you should have let him say it's his freedom of speech. Because it's not civil. We have this understanding of civility. Because if you remember what David Van Mill says, it's about competing values. Most philosophers and academics concerning freedom of speech, it's about competing values, okay? Because he says, and this is taken from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he says, the first thing to know in any sensible discussion of freedom of speech is that it will have to be limited. Every society places some limits on the exercise of speech because it always takes place within a context of competing values. Yeah. Now, one of the values that we have, hopefully in a British context, hopefully in a human context, is civility. If you don't have civility, it could be actually antithetical to the objectives of freedom of speech. If you don't have civility, how are you going to acquire truth? If you don't have civility, how are you going to pursue truth? If you don't have civility, how are you going to take people to account in the most appropriate way? If you don't have civility, how are you going to have scientific advancement and progress? So civility is so important, but there is an inconsistency in how we're using civility, and it exposes an ideological and political discourse that's happening at the moment, because there's Islamophobia that's rampant. You have a denigrated minority called the Muslim community, and it's okay to kick them when they're down. This is not decent behavior. It's not civility. And that's why, you have, the French laïcité, I call them extremists. They're extremists, honestly. They're incoherent, they're philosophically incoherent, and they're arrogant. Wow, they're intellectually arrogant, pseudo-intellectual arrogance, right? It's, it's about our liberty to express themselves. But the minute you say anything about the tricolor flag, or you defame the national anthem, you're in prison. I mean, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Wallahi, kufr will always contradict itself. The
Yeah, I mean,
rejection of the truth
even
will always
people,
contradict itself.
even people in France, non-Muslims have pointed out, those who are kind of cognizant of the racist undertones of the whole Charlie Hebdo stuff is like, middle-aged white dudes punching down on depicting African migrant women and dehumanizing characters and all that kind of stuff. They're like, we see what you're doing. That's not part of the spirit of free speech and so forth. And so it's very important to just dwell on the point that you mentioned about competing values and what I normally describe as concretizing, right? Because that's kind of the key. You see, whenever something like this happens, the mainstream narrative and the political establishment discourse is what there's these backward savage people who are upset because of their religiosity. Religiosity is something personal. They shouldn't bring out into the public domain. We just need to civilize them. Now the thing that we need to push is, and reframing that narrative is, to remind people that it's not an issue of Muslims are upset again about something unreasonable, full stop. It's the issue of Muslims exerting their subjectivity, i.e. they're outraged that these former colonial subjects would dare to demand that their concretization of competing values, how the cards fall for them, that they be treated as equals when it comes to the offending secular white post-Christian secular kind of norms and tastes.
Absolutely.
So it's not an issue of, it's like when somebody in amongst Muslims, right, when we might get a bit silly in how we kind of discuss things with each other and not follow the proper adab and so forth. Someone
Which
might
happens quite a lot, unfortunately.
maybe a bit. Someone might say, for example, disagree with your concretization of two competing values, right? They might say, for example, when you're traveling this distance, shorten your prayers or whatever, that exact thing, right? And the ease and the shortening the prayers or whatever. Someone else might say, another school of thought might say, actually this thing takes precedence over that. So you wouldn't shorten your prayers, you wouldn't combine prayers unless it's this and that condition. So an ignoramus would say, you're going against the sunnah, right? When what is actually happening is their concretization, their fatwa, their implementation is different to your one. And when you implement a ruling or any ethical consideration, you have to always juggle sometimes competing things, right? Like, for example, bravery or forgiveness. Yeah, forgiveness is something good, right? Forgiveness is a good value. However, if someone's being oppressive and oppressing someone else, are you going to be overly forgiving on someone else's behalf? No, you're not. So it's the issue of the implementation being different to the theory, and this is what the whole, for example, Sabil curriculum is built on, right? This difference between sources, understanding something, and its implementation, and the proper manhaj methodology of going through that. Now, this is the same when it comes to freedom of speech, for example. Freedom of speech, just personal liberty, appropriateness and inappropriateness, beauty and ugliness. These value-based kind of propositions, they have to be juggled by people, and people will come out with, this takes precedence over that takes precedence over this. So they'll say, this is your idea of appropriate or inappropriate behavior.
Yeah. So,
but the point is, the Muslim parents, they should have the right to say, for our children, this is what we deem appropriate and inappropriate. But the way it's spun is blasphemy, freedom of speech. When in actuality, it's an issue of this person's ideal concretization, or when they juggle the competing values of this person's idea of what is appropriate versus these people's idea of what is appropriate. And when Muslims rise to demand equal treatment and say, for our children, for our school, this is our idea of appropriateness and inappropriateness, and we have the right. If somebody's a so and so who's showing our children inappropriate stuff, it's our right. But it's our right to say get lost, right? But it's spun through that ancient kind of narrative of religious, zealot, blasphemy versus free speech.
Well, it's in a nutshell. I think what you're saying is that they're basically saying you should value what we value.
Yeah.
So the powers that be are basically saying to the Muslim community, and they do it to other communities too. They're saying you should value what we value, and you should prioritize your values the way we prioritize them.
Absolutely.
And you should restrict speech the way we want to restrict speech, not the way you want to restrict speech. But the true discussion that should be had is, what are the values that are going to facilitate a civil society that is based on, progress, truth, accountability in a way that is good for society as a whole? Now, let's turn the thought experiment the other way around. Imagine this religious teacher, and I'm not judging the situation because, to be honest, I don't know the nuances behind it. But imagine this religious teacher. He basically put up a cartoon that was anti-Semitic. And a lot of the children were from the Jewish tradition. They were Jewish. Would that even be allowed? I mean, would it even enter the mind of the teacher to do that? In any context, given the kind of history of what's happened in Europe? That wouldn't even be, they wouldn't even have a foot in the door. So given that example and that, mini thought experiment, it goes to show that there is a kind of treatment for one minority in this way and for another in another way, which exposes what? It exposes an internal psychology that, the Muslims must be a denigrated minority unless they adopt the values that we have, and unless they have the same ideological perspectives as we have. And this is very unjust, and it's not conducive to a cohesive society. And then I saw one philosopher on Twitter acknowledging the fact that this would be used against Muslims, and Muslims are already kind of denigrated in some way. That's how he was coming across. But he said that's besides the point. But it's not. It is part of the point, because it exposes an inconsistency in the treatment of different peoples within your society. So what kind of message are you showing people? So this has to be explained as well. So in the context of competing values, bro, take, for example, the Article 10 of the Human Rights Act in 1998. It says everyone has the right to freedom of expression. However, and it continues, speech may be subject to formalities, conditions, restrictions, or penalties as prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society. And what are these restrictions? So it elaborates: in the interest of national security, so that's a value, right? National security is a value. Territorial integrity or public safety, another value, rightly so. For the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health or morals, right? And so on and so forth. So there is an acknowledgement in law that there's going to be restrictions which are based on morality. So here's a question. Is it moral? Is it of value to deliberately degrade and defame a prophetic figure in order to pursue what you think is a lesson?
It is a value for some people, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَا تَسْمَعُوا لِهَذَا الْقُرْآنِ وَالْغَوْا فِيهِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَغْلِبُونَ. That the people who disbelieve say, at the time of the Prophet in Mecca, the Quraysh would say, don't listen to this recital, don't listen to this Quran, and make noise during it so that you may be successful, right? So from that angle, if somebody is hell-bent on denying the Quran, or it feels that there's some kind of personal loss for them for the truth to be kind of manifest, then they're going to try whatever they can, tooth and nail, to try and distract, to try and denigrate. So the resort to mockery, insult, caricature, and so forth is the preserve of the person who's lost an argument. Really, I mean, that's
Yes,
why we
that's
say
true.
put down
And
the
that's-
coloring book, put down
Yeah.
the crayons, and pick up a book, in lieu of some rational debate instead of.
But this is the point. That's why we
Yeah.
need to, if now the argument is that there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech, the slippery slope argument, the door swings both ways. We know it's incoherent. We know, as academics say, there are restrictions, and it's based on a competition of values, and therefore morals. So we should have a discussion now. What values and morals must we have in a society in order to basically fulfill the key objectives of freedom of speech, which is truth, accountability, and progress? Now, you know what's very interesting? When you have this kind of bizarre absolute attitude to freedom of speech, you create a post-truth culture. You create a culture where people don't care about truth anymore. They just care about what they want to say, whenever they want to say, how they want to say, irrespective of implication. And you have a Trump era, right? You have a post-truth Trump type of era. Reap what you sow. It's because there is no effective contemporary discussion on what values and morals must be the ones that we adopt in order to have the necessary restrictions of speech in order for us to fulfill the objectives of freedom of speech as a truth, accountability, and progress, as we said in the beginning. So it's not just, it's necessary to have freedom to insult and to degrade because that's necessary for freedom of speech. No, it's not. Because as we said previously in the beginning, there are thought experiments that you could articulate that basically prevent or they basically do not enable the objectives of freedom of speech to manifest in society. For, we use the example of Stephen Hawking. If he had this new true scientific theory and he started by spending 15 minutes insulting everyone's lineage and mother, that's not going to be conducive to him.
I wonder if you could get a fatwa or something for any time somebody makes that argument, you just start swearing at them. Just to see, just insulting the one ton insult, just to teach them the difference between accidentally, offending someone whilst making a cogent point and deliberately trying to provoke and insult someone.
But that's why we need to say to people that we shouldn't fall for the freedom of speech trap. And we say this has nothing to do with freedom of speech. It's
absolutely
values and morals, as we discussed philosophically from this perspective. And it's really them saying, we want you to value what we value. We want you to have this moral paradigm, which is really it's a secular paradigm. And that needs to be challenged in a positive way with wisdom and with positive articulation. And we need to be brave enough to do that. So we shouldn't fall for the trap that it's about freedom of speech versus the Muslims. With all due respect, there are so many examples, even in British society, when it's conducive to some people or the powers that be, their likes or dislikes, they basically call something offensive and they take people to court or they ban them or they remove them from platforms. But when it comes to, denigrating a minority and its symbols and its religious figures, then that's not a problem. That's freedom of speech. And what's interesting,
that's power. That's the power's ability to shape how a story is presented. Simple as that.
Absolutely.
I mean,
I think
you mentioned that. Okay, let's think about as a society, what are the values and what are the priorities that what are the things that we should prioritize in order to fulfill the objectives of free speech and truth and accountability and so forth. So what would you say some of those are?
It's a very, 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 very good topic. I mean, the first thing that one needs to do is that we have to actually value the objectives of freedom of speech, right? Because we valued the instrument, but we haven't valued the ends. We value the means more than the ends.
Yeah.
So let's value truth. What is truth? Why is it important? What is true progress, scientific and technological progress in a society? What is good and true accountability? So these are very important topics. Do we treat truth as a moral value, or is it just instrumental, right? All of these things need to be discussed in some way, but at least we should value the objects of freedom of speech. That's the first point. So we have to understand that freedom of speech is an instrument. It's a means to these objectives which are necessary for human flourishing. In actual fact, even John Stuart Mill said something very similar about that it's about human flourishing, or it's about our progress, and so on and so forth. So let's value the objectives of freedom of speech. Okay, then what we need to do, we need to basically also value civility. I'm a true believer that
be a civilized person.
Yeah,
that's it.
because
easy.
That's why, I would argue, some of these French ideological extremists, who really want to always bash, and denigrate minorities and stuff like that. These people, they're uncivilized. They hate civility. They hate civility because what do we mean by civility? Because civility dictates that we want a society that is constructed in a way that you can have truth, accountability, and progress to the utmost degree, to the most maximal degree. And that requires a sense of understanding, cooperation, understanding other people, understanding what makes you distinct. Because Allah says something very powerful in the Quran, that He created us from a male and female and made us into tribes and nations in order to what? لِتَعَرَفُوا, to know one another. The Mufassirin, this is not a neoliberal thing that says, oh, there's more that unites us, that makes us different. This could be utter bakwas sometimes, yeah? What's important, the Quran is saying, understand what makes you different. What makes you distinct? Because it's these differences and these distinctions that actually can be the source of anxiety, fear, and civil unrest, if you like. Once you start to understand the human nature behind them, or the validity behind them, and all of these things, then it removes the anxiety, fear, and frustration. So we need to create a Quranic society that is based on this getting to know one another in a true sense, that removes all the barriers to being uncivil. And this is very important, and it's not discussed, which is a shame. For example, if I want to articulate my truth, someone who is considered as a preacher to Islam, if you like, if I want to discuss my truth to, say, a religious tradition, the duty is on me to understand them, to understand their language, their culture, their context, and yes, their sensitivities. Why? Because my objective is not my ego. My objective is not to say, I'm right, you're wrong, to the degree where I destroy any chance of them accepting the truth. My objective is, how do I take my fellow human being on a journey towards the truth? So therefore, the moral duty is on me to do whatever is necessary to achieve that. So in the context of this teacher that brought this cartoon, he should have understood that context more. And as again, I don't know what actually happened, but say
from what is reported,
it is the way it's been portrayed. He could have taught that lesson in a way that didn't require any promotion of that cartoon. Because even as a philosopher, you could have so many different thought experiments and examples that don't have to refer to the thing that you're talking about that is sensitive in nature. This is adab. This is sensitivity. This is civility. Now don't get me wrong.
It's more than just someone showing the cartoon, though. Remember, so it's the parents would be just the parent. As a parent, I would want to know that someone teaching my child isn't someone who has such a juvenile understanding of free speech, for example, because there's so many other things that could get mixed up with that, right? Someone who just, they believe wanton insult and so-called blasphemy, even though I don't using that phrase because of its European connotations, Eurocentric connotation. What kind of environment is that teacher or is that kind of lesson going to foster if you're encouraging just insult for the purpose of insult? Again, not some kind of rational argument which you might find incidentally, a bit offensive, but actual mockery and cartoon.
Of course, there is a clear difference between intellectual tone and deliberate and gratuitous insult, right? There's a massive difference. And the Islamic intellectual tradition, throughout its history, has been known to have intellectual debates and dialogues on these issues, right?
Yeah.
And even to raise these issues, but it was done within a intellectual tone that was somehow there was some kind of collective sincerity that this was about trying to find out the truth of the matter.
Yeah.
But in
And
popular
even subhanAllah, sorry to cut you off, even when Muslims are instructed to, when giving da'wah, Allah says, فَلَا تَسُبُّ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ فَيَسُبُّ اللَّهَ عَدْوًا بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. Don't curse those that the idols that they worship. Don't curse them. Don't. And you're saying it's a false god, so that's enough of a denigration, right? But there's a difference between saying don't worship the idol and actually mocking it and cursing it and so forth.
Yeah.
Because
So
then Allah says they're going to then curse Allah just out of stubbornness and tit for tat.
Yeah, for sure. Take for example, my personal experience. Yeah. So about 6 years ago or something, I said something about the founder of the Turkish Republic. Right?
I remember that. That was just to sell your Turkish book, right?
No, it wasn't actually.
That probably went viral.
I didn't even write a book then at that time. Anyway, and what happened was, it got viral 6 years later or something. In retrospect, was it the right thing to do? No, because the way I articulated myself wasn't following the ayah of the Quran. Because with all due respect, that individual has become literally like an idol for many people.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. And the way I express myself, although what I have certain beliefs about this situation for sure, but the way I express myself as a public figure, was it conducive to taking people on a journey so they understand what I understand to be the truth? No. So that was a mistake. And that is case in point, that I want to articulate to the masses about a particular individual that I believe was X, Y, and Z. How do I do that in a way that takes them on the journey? And that requires, for example, me to appreciate that the truth is more important than just me merely expressing my opinion about a matter. And this is civility. And this is if you respect truth and you respect accountability and progress and all of the objectives of freedom of speech, then you're not going to be so naive and egocentric and egotistical just to say things just for the sake of it. But yeah, we appreciate there are some gray areas as well. Even if you're sensitive and even if you try your best, you may get yourself in a sticky wicket. That's life. I'm not saying it's all black and white. But when it comes to these type of situations, it's very clear on that there were other ways possible to be able to convey your truth or the truth, convey the message in a way that doesn't require you to denigrate and to degrade, and to create a political social environment that facilitates the furtherance of denigrating a already downtrodden minority. And this is very important to understand, because it's not just about philosophy. This is about society and politics and how we view other people. And do we want this to exist? No, we don't want this to exist, not only to the Muslims, but to any minority. We don't want this to the Jewish people. We don't want this to the Sikhs. We don't want this to happen to anyone, because we believe in necessary morals in a particular society, which include civility. I truly believe civility is a moral value from that perspective.
Prophet Sallam, he's famously said, إنما بعثت لأتمم صالح الأخلاق. Right, I was only sent to perfect noble qualities of character. Right. Okay.
Absolutely, 100%.
So and this is something we should be pushing, because it's interesting and I think beneficial to talk about. Okay, what's our positive case, for the competing values and concretization.
Yeah. So take even historically, like Islamic Spain, where even Western academics called it paradise on earth. It was a convivencia, a coexistence of different peoples. European enlightenment and scientific progress is predicated on the historical milestone of Islamic Spain. Read the works of Thomas Arnold and his preaching of Islam and so on and so forth. And that happened. Why? Because there was a social political framework that didn't have this kind of liberal kind of principle distance. And it was more of No, we're gonna convey and propagate and promulgate certain
Yeah.
key values in society
I mean
concerning.
that's liberalism's kind of entanglement with modernity and colonialism and imperialism and white supremacy and stuff. It's very deeply embedded into it, and Islamic is just one other example. Islamic civilization of. I remember reading yesterday, I was brother who's in Greece, a Greek island. He's there. Actually, I don't want to mention too much because I think he's doing something for his career, his job and stuff. But he was saying he was just walking down the street and not fully non-Muslim area, like a Greek island, and he goes, there was a sign to a mosque, an old Ottoman mosque, and he goes, he followed the sign, and there was some curator there, a non-Muslim Greek fellow, and he's like, finally someone, is coming to the thing because of lockdown and all that. So he gave him a tour and everything, and he said, the Ottomans by no means perfect, right? They had a lot of issues, but he said we had more freedom. People had more freedom under the Ottomans than they do today, right? And he was like, really? He goes, but you wouldn't tell from looking at the kind of the public polemics about Greece and Turkey and that kind of stuff. But he said, we don't say this in public. He said, the curator said, he goes, we all talk about this privately, but we don't say this in public. And then I remembered a 7th century Christian bishop, right? I read somewhere in just this book, just as a reference, right? I was just checking. I had someone mention it, and I found it there. He was saying, he was in Mesopotamia somewhere. I think, anyway, it was in the time of Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, yeah? So very early on, Banu Umayyah, the first kingdom after the Khulafa Rashidun. And he said, these Muslims, they're all right. You pay your taxes, they leave you alone and stuff. But I've got one criticism of them. They don't persecute the Jews.
Oh my God.
That was his criticism of Muslims. He's like, why are they treating them so nicely and that kind of stuff. So this is what I wanted to, another thing I wanted to kind of segue to, and that is, it's one thing to say, okay, for a society to flourish, here are the values that we should inculcate with each other, and here is the priority that we should give to certain things. But it's another thing to say, look, to be mature enough to say, look, we're going to actually disagree on that. This community, that group there, even within the community, people are going to disagree on the exact concretization of where the cards fall once you mix all the values into the pot. And I think that is the thing that modernity has struggled with so much. And that is the thing that Islam pretty early on, because you have to make a decision, right? If you're an expansionist kind of worldview and you're calling people to your ranks and stuff, are you going to completely bulldoze everyone who's not like you, or are you going to actually, learn to live and let live, right? This is obviously the decision, quote unquote, that Islamic civilization made early on.
Yeah, but that's not happening today, unfortunately, because I was speaking about this earlier. I was doing something with King's College, and this idea that just because you find, for example, a sexual practice to be unethical, now the narrative is forming that therefore you discriminate against human beings. There is no logical link between finding something unethical and just because the person who's doing that unethical thing, that now you're going to discriminate, hate, and want to basically be unjust to the person who's doing it. But that's what's happening. And what they're trying to do, they're trying to create a kind of a monolithic value culture that everyone has the same values and same ideas and same ideological constructs. And this is one of the failures of modern liberalism, I believe, where, liberalism was supposed to be this kind of, tolerance and all minorities can be together and everyone live and share ideas and discuss. That actually, it's a failed project, because what you see from an applied point of view, you see that what liberalism is trying to do is just make everyone liberal. That's the problem. And that's one of the failures of liberalism, because it
whilst being blind to its own biases, and like I said, religiosity, right? Sometimes we kind of play into that as well. So if you look at our kind of response to hijab bans and that kind of stuff, right? We kind of fall into the whole religious rights versus public life kind of paradigm that they've given us. Whereas what we normally argue in Assumption, for example, is look, get yourself out of that. Imagine if a white British lady was shipped off to some, the Amazon rainforest where there's a tribe there that just their norm is walking around topless, right? And she says, well, actually, that's not, for me, my norm is I should be covered from here to here in public. This is why I should be covered, where I should be covered. Now, she's not going to articulate herself in the language of this is a Christian blouse. Yeah. and they're not going to say, or they shouldn't say, this is okay, this is a religious exception for you. But no, because she's not talking religion or whatever. This is regardless of where the sources of that norm or cultural value or mori. This is what is normal for her, a normative practice for her to cover in public. Likewise, for the Muslim woman, the normative practice for her to cover in public includes her hair, right? Yes. And if we argue on the basis of, I feel, the religious exemption and so forth, we've successfully provincialized that woman and accepted the dominant norm, the universalizing of the white Christian kind of concretization of this is what is normal to be covered in public. Rather, it should be about forcing ourselves onto the table as equals, right? You may think that this is the norm of behavior in public, of whatever it is, but we believe otherwise. Either you're going to try and suppress us or civilize us, or you could actually have a grown-up discussion and try and live and let live.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a problem, and that's why our narrative concerning these type of issues should be, well, this is what I know to be true, and I know to be moral, and I have justifications for this philosophically and otherwise. And I'm not going to assume that you are the kind of self-evident default position, or that you are the kind of majority default position, you are the kind of beacon of truth and morality. No, I have the haqq, I have the truth, and I want to articulate that to you. Now, either you can basically, as you said, try and oppress me and subjugate me, or you consider me as an equal and you understand my positions. And if you disagree with them, then just live and let live, right? From that perspective. Yeah, absolutely. So that, you're right. So I think that's a very, very important thing.
So we talked about...
I think
go ahead.
I think the message to the Muslim community should be, that should be one of the key messages to empower them. Don't fall for the trap of the freedom of speech issue. We know freedom of speech has to be restricted in some way. There's almost an academic consensus on this.
And it's impossible for it not to be. It's like a...
Yes, and that is based on competing values and morals. So what we should do, we should say, hey, this is a red herring, this freedom of speech stuff. We believe in truth, accountability, and progress, which are the objectives of freedom of speech. We believe these morals and values are the right way, right? And we have justifications for this. And either you could try and subjugate us, or you listen to our discourse and narrative. And if we disagree, we live and let live. And that's more of an empowering position. And unfortunately, I think we haven't got there yet in terms of a collective narrative amongst the Muslim community to be able to articulate that position. We should say, look, this is the way forward. These are the morals and values you need to provide the necessary restrictions of speech in order to fulfill its objectives. You need to listen to us. So the Muslim community must become, in my view, an intellectual, moral beacon of light. Honestly. Because remember, Muslims, we must be committed to all human beings. Love for humanity, we're love for yourself. And this commitment is we're committed to their goodness and their guidance. And this is exactly what we should be doing. So that would be the kind of take-home message of community leaders. By the way, It's unbelievable.
What's coming up?
You have some Muslims who, like, their responses to this issue is, who are you, man? Like, what's wrong with these people? Like, where's your iman? Like, wallahi, I feel it's like, let's call a spade, bro. Let's like, you know, forget this intellectualism for a moment. Some people's statements on this issue are not only philosophically incoherent, but it's as if they have never read the Quran before in their life, or they've never read the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam before. And I'm thinking to myself, why are these people trying to take leadership? If you have an inferiority complex, if you don't know how to defend the Islamic tradition properly, the best thing you should do is, frankly, shut up. That's the best thing you should do. You know, wallahi, but yet people will articulate themselves in ways that are so antithetical to normative mainstream Islamic tradition. Wow, I find it so shocking, man.
So that brings us on to some of the comments we've been getting. We've got a lot of comments, mashallah. Samiul Quran.
Why do you just brush me aside like that, bro?
Zakwan,
That's so
Hassan.
unfair.
I'm trying to do a little wicked mix
comment.
move for a nice little segue.
At least say you agree with me.
No, I mean, I want you to actually expand on this, because the questions that they're saying is, okay, what are your what are the best ways of actually dealing with this issue? Because, you know, sometimes, you know, we might play into the trap of the using the narratives and behavior of what right wing kind of racist kind of newspapers they want to show us as doing. But what and so kind of, you know, it helps it become mainstream kind of news and makes a martyr out of the people perpetrators. So what is your view on how we should actually respond? Should we go and bun up some cars, or
What? I think I just... Sorry?
should we go and bun up some cars? You
What
know,
does that
start... Oh, yeah, you don't know what that means.
No, I don't. Bun up. You say burn?
No. What? But okay, so the one is obviously, you know,
Why are you
start
saying
rioting and all that kind of stuff, right?
Listen,
thought
okay,
you were from
obviously
Hackney,
no
bro. I thought you
writing
know
for
the
sure.
lingo.
Look, we already mentioned the kind of narrative we should be pursuing, but the something that we've missed out. We should also show to people why we love the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I truly believe anyone who learns his life, learns his teachings, looks at all the corpus of the material concerning his teaching, concerning economics, concerning social cohesion, concerning love, mercy, compassion, justice, law, so on and so forth, politics, so on and so forth. Once they understand the message of the Prophet ﷺ, that, you know, there is no deity worthy of worship. He must be known, he must be loved, he must be obeyed, and we must direct all acts of worship to God alone. And that we must follow the Prophet ﷺ in order to be recipients of divine love and forgiveness. Because Allah says, say to the Prophet ﷺ, say, if you love Allah, then follow me, and Allah will love you and forgive your sins. You know, if we show them this and if they explore this, I truly believe they will fall in love with the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we should have a sense of empathy that they don't have anyone like this they love. With all due respect, who loves someone like we love the Prophet sallam? That the sacrifice that we will make and the yearning that we have for him in terms of love and affection, I don't think anyone has that. And it's really sad that no one has that in their lives, right? You know, we live in a very kind of, you know, egocentric, narcissistic society now that even, you know, the partners that we love, they're just projections of our own selves. We don't really love the other. We're just loving our own selves. It's a crisis of love. Like one German philosopher, he's a Korean descent, but German philosopher, he wrote the book called The Crisis of Eros, I believe. Phenomenal book, by the way. You should read it. That we don't know how to love anymore. People don't know how to love. People will never make the sacrifices that we will for the Prophet ﷺ, for even their own mothers or for their own beloveds, like wife, partners, whatever. And that's sad. How can you live a life without that type of love? And we should feel for people, honestly. The Prophet ﷺ is our beloved. And we should show them why they should love him too. And this should be the narrative. We love the Prophet ﷺ because he was the messenger of Allah. He was Habibullah. He was the love of Allah. Following him is a way to manifest and understand and practice your purpose in life, which is to worship Allah, which means to know Allah, to love Allah, to obey him, and to direct all acts of worship to him alone.
So here's a question here's a contention from someone in the comments, right? Toby Luke 1, and you probably hear this a lot. I'm quite sure schools show the life of Brian a blasphemous film, mocking Isa alayhi salam, but mobs don't go and form and no one goes into hiding. Learning and seeing things you don't like is not getting angry is part of life.
Well, there's a difference between being angry and how you manifest that anger. Like, no one has a right to say you're not allowed to be angry about something. Of course you should be. It's a natural emotion, and if you have it in the right way, it's not blameworthy at all. For sure. If someone insults someone that you love a lot, if you don't feel a sense of anger, then you don't really love that person, right? But the question is now, how do you manifest that anger? Yeah, so I would agree. You're not going to have mobs and burning cars and being
I think
violent.
that's a bit of a red herring anyway. Nobody's burning cars anyway.
But that's the whole point.
Yeah.
It is a red herring. It's a smelly fish that's dragged along the path of running dogs to divert them to, another direction.
What color is
it? So it's a red herring. So no one says that you should do that. But what right do you have to say to people they can't be angry and they can't protest? In actual fact, according to the absolutists here who say freedom of speech is absolute, then you shouldn't complain about them protesting, because isn't that their freedom of speech as well? Yeah. Your whole argument falls on the floor. You're saying the teacher should have done that. It's his freedom of speech. Okay, so don't complain about the parents. It's their freedom of speech as well.
And that highlights the kind of double standards. And it's also in the question, sorry to the questioner, not to kind of like rinse you, but there's a premise in the question that you should act like we act, that we are the standard. We don't have any respect for any the reputation of Isa alayhi salam or any historical figure.
Habibi, listen to this. Secularism has destroyed, there's nothing sacred anymore. The only sacred thing in secularism, generally speaking, is secularism itself.
And prophets.
Everything else has basically, you've removed anything sacred. And you've seen that in this society. We don't
They went from respecting prophets, alayhim salam, to profit.
Yeah, you're right.
Deep.
Absolutely. Yeah, mashallah.
If I do say so myself.
Your little buzzer or your bell.
I had to. I just came up with that on the spot.
No, you're right. So they've removed anything sacred. And let me tell you something. And think about this. If you remove any sense of the sacred in society, what you end up doing is you end up with the form of what you call self-worship. That you start worshipping the ego. And once you start worshipping the ego, you start worshipping the shahawat, the blameworthy desires. And once that happens, you would end up having a society that will be full of social degradation and decay. Reap what you sow. Be very careful. If you remove the sacred, you're going to have another idol. You're going to have something else that you're going to try to sanctify. And that may end up being yourself. This is like the Nietzschean prophetic kind of vision that he had when he said God is dead. He didn't say God is dead, that he doesn't exist per se. He said God is dead in the hearts of European people. And once people understand that, they're going to realize they can't have any values anymore. They can't ground their values in anything objective. And then they're going to realize that the only way to do that is to ground values in themselves. And Nietzsche even understood, but that means everyone's going to have their own different set of values. And there's going to be like a competition of values based on, their own perspectives and egos. Yeah. And then he basically replied, if you like, well, I have my values, where are yours? And I think he had almost like a prophetic statement about where we're heading as Europeans and Brits in the West, where, if you remove God and, the sacred out of the picture, you end up basically having this form of self-aggrandizement and self-worship from that perspective. And you're going to see some very dangerous things that our moral values are going to be drifting from a social perspective to this kind of
to worshipping the material impulses.
Well, listen, that it's going to be social decay and fragmentation, and unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of signs of that at the moment, which is quite unfortunate. But that's another discussion to be had about moral values and objective moral values and the role of God and divine command theory, all of that stuff. Yeah.
Have you seen the one who takes his
desires on Lord,
impulses
absolutely.
as his own God?
Yeah. So, but that's a different discussion. So I think two things should be said again, just to repeat, if people are just coming on now, that the main message should be is that this has nothing to do with freedom of speech. It's about freedom of speech has to be restricted necessarily, even according to academics. But the question is, that is based upon competing values and morals. So therefore, we should say this is nothing to do with freedom of speech. It's to do with what morals and values are going to be those that will provide the necessary restrictions to speech in order to fulfill the objectives of freedom of speech, which is truth, accountability, and progress. And we should be equal partners in that discussion. And we should say, these are the moral values of civility, values of good akhlaq, and so on and so forth. And we've shown them to have worked throughout our history. And we've shown that it's still conducive to progress and accountability and truth. And that's what we should show. That's the discussion we should have in a very assertive, positive, intellectual way. And on the other hand, we should show them why this response is actually justified, because we love this man, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we need to show why we love him.
Yeah.
And once we get people to explore that, then it gives them a chance to love him too and really understand who he was and how he would liberate us from the shackles of our own selves, right? And
Sheikh Haytham added as well that one reason why we should be active in defending the Prophet ﷺ and putting forth these arguments and this alternative to building actually a civil society, obviously in a wise way. He said one reason is you don't want to let it linger to get worse and worse, and then Allah will punish us all. Allah will punish the society, because this is our country. If something becomes endemic in a society, then many times in history, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has destroyed people for their animosity to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allah said, "Inna kafaynaka al-mustahzi'in." We have certainly sufficed you of the mockers. And inna shani'aka huwa al-abtar. Your enemy, your obnoxious enemy, is the one who's cut off. So we don't want this to spread either into the society, regardless to because this is our home. Jazakallah khair, bro, for your time. I think I'll let you go now, inshallah.
May Allah bless you, bro. Jazakallah for the opportunity. May Allah bless you. And
you.
Have you got cane rolls on now or something?
No. My wife actually was doing it the other day because my hair's gone quite long, but I'm not wearing it. I was just wearing a little man hairband. Thanks for exposing me there. I thought it was hidden in there.
No, it looks really nice, bro. You look, mashallah,
Thanks,
very
bro.
nice.
Just come down to the ends and get some free kebabs from Bossman. Inshallah.
Take care. Jazakallah for the opportunity, bro.
Barakallah feek. Jazakallah khair, bro.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And assalamu alaikum and jazakumullah khairan for you guys watching at home. Hamza's still there listening cheekily. Stick around, we'll have a little gap shop in a minute. But if you like this podcast, give it a like and a share. I think people are still watching, alhamdulillah. But you can rewind and forward and all that kind of stuff. You can't forward from now because it's, future. But if you're watching this, it's going to be going out on the normal podcast platforms, Apple, iTunes, Spotify, Google, all that kind of stuff. Remember to subscribe if you're into this stuff. If you liked it, give it a like. If you disliked it, then press the thumb downs button twice. That's it from me. I'll speak to you later, and I'll leave you with this cool little outro. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.